It was a Saturday night in January 1922, and the city of Washington, D.C. had been buried under snow for 2 straight days. Somewhere on 18th Street, in a warm and glittering theater, 300 people sat down to watch a comedy and were laughing when the ceiling came down. 98 of them never walked out. This is the story of the worst disaster in the history of the American capital, and almost no one today knows it happened. To understand how something like this could happen, you need to go back to the beginning, not to the night of the disaster, but to the man who built the place, because this story does not start with a storm. It starts with ambition. Harry Crandall was not born into money. He was a 4th-grade dropout who had started out delivering telegrams and working as a grocery clerk, but he had a talent for seeing opportunity before anyone else did, and in the early years of the 20th century, the opportunity was the movies. Silent cinema was sweeping America, and people who had never set foot in a concert hall or an opera house were pouring into theaters every weekend, hungry for entertainment and hungry to be transported somewhere else. Crandall understood that if you gave them a beautiful place to sit, they would keep coming back. By the time he commissioned his greatest project, he already owned a small empire of cinemas stretching across Washington, Maryland, Virginia, and West Virginia. But this one was going to be different from everything he had built before. He chose a plot of land at the corner of 18th Street and Columbia Road, in Adams Morgan, one of the most fashionable and affluent neighborhoods in the capital. The site was unusual. The 2 roads met at an oblique angle, creating a wedge-shaped parcel of land that most builders would have found awkward. But Crandall saw it as a canvas. For the design, he hired a young architect named Reginald Geer, a rising figure in Washington who had already made a name building upscale residences and smaller venues across the city, and gave him a clear brief: build the largest, most extraordinary movie theater Washington had ever seen. What Geer produced was genuinely remarkable. He turned the triangular plot into a feature, shaping the building's floor plan like an elongated wedge with the stage at the narrow tip, so that the space felt like it opened up toward the audience rather than closing around them. The exterior was Georgian Revival, clad in Indiana limestone and what one newspaper described, with great enthusiasm, as Pompeian art brick. The facade followed the gentle curve of Columbia Road, giving the building an almost organic quality, as if it had grown from the street rather than been imposed upon it. Inside, the color scheme was ivory, gold, and pale blue. There were reserved boxes for the city's elite, a mezzanine level with luxurious parlors, a Japanese tea room on the 2nd floor, and something that many theaters of the era did not yet have: a proper ventilation system. Geer had thought of everything, or so it appeared. The theater seated 1,700 people, making it the largest venue of its kind in the entire city, and when the Knickerbocker Theatre opened its doors in October of 1917, it did so with a buffet dinner, a gathering of silent film celebrities, and a screening of a drama called Betsy Ross, starring Alice Brady, who was present in person that evening to greet the crowd. The Washington Post declared it wholly unlike anything of the kind yet built in Washington. Washington's elite came for the films, for the concerts, for the lectures, and Harry Crandall had what he had always been reaching for: a masterpiece. But inside its walls, invisible to every eye that had ever admired them, something was already wrong. When Geer designed the roof, he specified that the steel supporting beams be inserted 8 inches deep into the masonry walls on both sides of the theater, which was the required depth to properly anchor the structure. Somewhere during construction, for reasons that were never fully explained, the contractor installed those beams at only 2 inches deep, a quarter of the required depth, so that rather than being secured within the masonry, the beams were simply resting on top of it. The building inspector came and approved the work. The city signed off. The theater opened, and for 5 years nobody knew, because the flaw was invisible. The walls looked solid, the ceiling looked solid, and every seat was filled every weekend with people who had every reason to feel safe. January 1922 begins quietly in Washington, with a mild winter by the city's standards and the usual rhythm of a capital going about its business. Then, late in the month, the weather shifts. On the 26th of January, a storm moves up the eastern seaboard in the way that winter systems sometimes do on the American East Coast, not with great drama in its arrival, no violent winds or sudden temperature collapse, but with a quiet, relentless persistence that makes it all the more dangerous. It simply begins to snow, and then it keeps snowing, and it does not stop. Within 12 hours, the accumulation is already severe. Within 24 hours, Washington is paralyzed. Streets that were full of cars and horse-drawn carts the day before are now impassable, trams have stopped running, most businesses are closed, and people are stuck in their homes, watching from their windows as the snow keeps falling and piling higher and higher against their front doors. By the time the storm finally begins to ease on the morning of January 28th, the city has received 28 inches of snow, a figure that is not a historical footnote but still the record because over a century later, no single snowfall in Washington, D.C. has ever exceeded what fell in those 2 days. Temperatures throughout the storm hovered between 20 and 25 degrees Fahrenheit, which meant the snow was not the light, dry kind that blows off a surface in the wind. It was dense and wet and compacting under its own weight, and it clung to every horizontal surface it landed on. It did not move unless something moved it. The Knickerbocker Theatre had a flat roof, not a pitched roof that sheds water and snow by gravity, but a flat one with no drainage system capable of managing an accumulation of this scale. For 2 full days, that snow had been building above the heads of every person who walked past the building on 18th Street, above the beautiful plasterwork ceiling inside the auditorium, above the steel framework that was, as the audience inside had no way of knowing, resting rather than anchored in those walls. Nobody was on the roof shoveling. Nobody was measuring the weight of what was accumulating overhead. There was also something else that most people who walked into the Knickerbocker that evening would never have known. During the original construction of the building, back in 1916 and 1917, the United States was at war, and material shortages were a fact of life across every industry. Heavy-gauge structural steel, the kind specified for the roof trusses of a building with a span as wide as the Knickerbockers, was difficult to obtain. Lighter steel was substituted for the heavier grade originally called for, approved and quietly absorbed into the build, and on paper the theater still met the codes, but in reality the roof had been carrying a load it was never truly designed to bear from the moment it was completed. By the evening of January 28th, the storm is winding down and the snow has largely stopped, and people who have been cooped up indoors for 2 days begin to venture out, not in vehicles, because the streets are still buried and impassable to anything with wheels, but on foot. The Knickerbocker Theatre was open that evening, management having decided to run the show despite the conditions, and the box office was selling tickets at 25 cents a seat. The film on the program was a silent comedy called Get Rich Quick Wallingford, based on a celebrated George M. Cohan Broadway play, a story about a charming con man who keeps finding ways to turn his schemes into something respectable, and the audience who came through the snow to see it found it very funny. Getting the orchestra together for the evening had not been easy, with only 11 of the 20 scheduled musicians managing to make it through the snow, but the show went on with a reduced ensemble. From the neighborhood around 18th Street and Columbia Road, people began arriving on foot: a former United States congressman, 2 journalists from the National Press Club, a father and his son and his daughter, the Fleming family, who lived about a mile away and had decided the walk was manageable, a young violinist in the orchestra named Joseph Wade Beale, who had married his childhood sweetheart just 4 days earlier, and 15-year-old Kirkland Duke, who had come with his friend David, who had in turn invited his 14-year-old cousin Charles Lyman III, a prep school student visiting Washington who had promised to join them after he finished his homework. About 300 people settled into their seats that evening in the balcony and the orchestra section below, and given the theater's capacity of 1,700, it was a quiet night. The film began, the orchestra played, and high above them all, on the flat roof, the snow sat without moving. There is something particular about the way this disaster unfolds that makes it so difficult to comprehend even today, and it comes down to a single fact. There was no warning, no creaking in the structure, no gradual sagging that might have given people the moment they needed to get up from their seats and move toward an exit. Nothing that distinguished this evening from any other Saturday night at the Knickerbocker in the 5 years since it had opened. What was happening above the audience was invisible to them. The steel roof trusses had been bending slowly under the weight of the snow for hours, perhaps for most of that day, and bending rather than breaking is precisely what made the process so silent. Metal under stress deforms gradually before it gives way, and the beams that were supposed to be anchored 8 inches deep in the masonry were instead resting on just a shallow ledge, so as they bent under the load, they were working their way free of even that minimal grip on the wall. It was a process measured in millimeters, unfolding across hours, completely invisible to the 300 people sitting in the ivory and gold auditorium below, watching a comedy. Sometime just after 9 in the evening, a hairline crack opened in the plaster ceiling above the stage, and a faint cloud of white dust drifted down into the light from the projection beam. Some people in the audience may have noticed it. Nobody in that theater could have known what it meant, and the orchestra kept playing without pause. Then came a sound. Survivors described it differently in the days afterward. Some said it was a hiss, like the tearing of heavy fabric. Some said it was more like a sharp exhalation of air from something under enormous pressure, and one described it as the sound of the world inhaling before it screamed. And then, without any further notice, the entire roof came down as a single mass, all at once, the flat expanse of steel and concrete decking and plaster, and 2 days of packed snow striking the concrete balcony with an impact the balcony could not absorb. The balcony collapsed onto the orchestra section below. Sections of the exterior brick walls, weakened by the rows of large windows that had been cut through them, caved inward into the wreckage, and in the space of perhaps 3 or 4 seconds, the Knickerbocker Theatre had ceased to exist as a place where anything was safe. The Evening Star newspaper, the following morning, described the moment with a precision that no modern account has improved upon. A stillness, an unearthly pause, followed the din, then a scream, an agonized cry, a moan, and beneath tons of steel and masonry scores of men, women, and children were buried. The Washington Post's theater critic, a man named John J. Daly, had been in the building that night to review the film. He had a personal habit of sitting in an aisle seat close to an exit door because he liked to move quietly during screenings without disturbing people, and that habit saved his life. He ran across the street to a drugstore, telephoned his editors to tell them what had happened, then went back into the ruins to help pull survivors from the debris. And later that night he walked through the snow all the way to the Washington Post offices downtown, in which he described the theater, previously the Temple of Mirth, as having been transformed into a tomb. Charles Lyman III, the 14-year-old who had stayed behind to finish his homework, was walking toward the theater through the snow when the roof came down. He was half a block away. He heard a sound he could not identify, followed immediately by screaming. His cousin David, who had gone in ahead of him, did not survive, and David's friend, Kirkland Duke, 15 years old, did not survive either. The story of survival that Washington would talk about most in the days that followed was the story of Helen. She had been trapped under the debris in the dark, injured but conscious, and for hours in the wreckage, while rescue workers moved through the ruins above her, she called out to direct them toward other survivors she could hear nearby. She sang songs to the people she could hear around her, urging them to hold on, and when rescuers finally broke through to where she was buried, they found that her long hair had become tangled in the debris and had to cut it free before they could lift her out. She was the first trapped victim removed from the theater alive, carried out on a stretcher to the First Church of Christ, Scientist across the street, which had already been converted into a triage station, and her words when they brought her into the light were, "Mother, it was the everlasting arms that saved me." She was a Girl Scout troop leader, and when soldiers told her afterward that they could not find words to praise her courage, she told them simply that she was a Girl Scout and could do no less. First Lady Florence Harding, reading about her in the newspapers, sent her a large signed photograph and bouquets of flowers while she recovered at home. In the wreckage, rescuers found a woman still conscious and holding her husband's body tightly in her arms, unwilling to let him go. They had to carry her away from him to get her to a hospital. A man named Scott Montgomery was found alive and pinned under the debris, and when rescuers reached him, he begged them to leave him and save the women first, but the crew managed to get him free regardless, and he died at Walter Reed Hospital 2 hours later. Joseph Wade Beale, the young violinist who had been married 4 days before and was 22 years old, did not survive. The streets around the theater were still buried under the same snow that had brought the roof down, which meant fire engines could not get through. The city's telephone operator, receiving the first call reporting the collapse, immediately spread the alarm to police, firefighters, and hospitals all at once, and also called the city government, which made a decision within minutes. Every other theater in Washington was to close immediately, in case the same conditions that had destroyed the Knickerbocker existed in buildings across the city, and within a short time every movie house in Washington went dark. The rescue that unfolded over the following hours was unlike anything the capital had ever had to organize. Neighbors poured in from the surrounding streets and pulled at the rubble with their bare hands. 14 fire companies eventually reached the scene, and over 600 soldiers and Marines were mobilized from barracks across the city and from Fort Myer across the Potomac River in Virginia, some of them arriving with army mules to haul equipment through the snow-blocked streets when vehicles could not get through. The man placed in command of the entire rescue operation was a 36-year-old Army major named George Patton, the same George Patton who more than 2 decades later would become the most celebrated American general of the Second World War. And on this night, in this snow, he was directing men through the ruins of a movie theater and writing home to his father afterward that the victims were pretty much flattened, and that many of the bodies were so compressed by the weight of the collapsed structure that identification was nearly impossible. Thomas Fleming, the father who had walked to the theater with his son and daughter that evening, was identified in the morgue not by his face but by his pocket watch. Reginald Gear, the theater's architect, who lived only a few blocks away, heard what had happened and came to the scene himself, spending the night helping pull bodies from the debris. His knowledge of the building's layout, every corridor and structural cavity he had drawn and specified, proving invaluable to rescuers trying to understand where survivors might still be found. The last survivor was removed from the wreckage the following morning, more than 17 hours after the roof fell, and by that point rescuers still had not been able to reach everyone in the orchestra section. The final count, when it was complete, was 98 dead and 133 injured, making the Knickerbocker collapse the deadliest single-day disaster in Washington, D.C.'s recorded history, a record that has never been broken. The morning after the collapse, Washington woke up to newspaper headlines that had spread overnight to every major city in the country. The disaster had made the front page of the New York Times and appeared in papers in Atlanta, Chicago, and London, because the capital of the United States had just experienced the deadliest single-day catastrophe in its history, inside one of its most celebrated buildings, and the question that every editor and every politician and every grieving family was asking was identical. How did this happen, and who was responsible? The investigations that followed were not coordinated or polished. They were the urgent, overlapping responses of institutions that understood something had gone catastrophically wrong on their watch. With the city coroner, Washington Post reporters stationed themselves at the ruins, at the hospitals, and at the makeshift morgue, recording the account of each survivor as they were brought out of the wreckage, and publishing the name of each person identified among the dead so that families across the city could find out what had happened to the people they were searching for. What the investigations uncovered was simultaneously straightforward and infuriating. The technical cause of the collapse was not mysterious. The steel trusses supporting the roof had failed because they were not properly embedded in the exterior walls, with Gear's own drawings having specified 8 inches of bearing depth, while the contractor had installed 2, so that under the combined weight of the packed snow and the roof structure itself, those shallow connections had simply given way, and the beams had slipped free of the walls and taken everything above and below with them. There was also the matter of the steel itself, which due to wartime material shortages during construction had been substituted for a lighter gauge than the heavier specification originally called for, a change absorbed without adequate review, and one that meant the roof had never been as strong as it was supposed to be. The roof truss design had been modified by the shop drawings of the steel fabricator without the structural engineer being consulted, and the fee structure of the project had been negotiated in a way that compressed the oversight available to the people who were supposed to be checking the work. The building that had opened so triumphantly in 1917 was the product of accumulated compromises, each one individually defensible, each one documented and approved, and collectively fatal. At the inquest, Gear and the steel fabricator's representative pointed at each other with a precision that was almost rehearsed. Gear testified that the collapse had been caused by a flaw in the structural steel, and the steel fabricator's representative blamed the defective walls, and each man's explanation was technically coherent, and each one was also, in its own way, an attempt to survive what was coming. The coroner's jury found the deaths attributable to faulty construction and faulty design, and a grand jury was convened and indicted 5 men on criminal manslaughter charges. Gear himself, the man responsible for designing the steel framework, the hollow tile wall subcontractor, the reinforced concrete inspector, and the builder's foreman. The case never went to trial. Federal Judge Frederick Lincoln Siddons reviewed the indictments, found them too vague to sustain, and dismissed them, and the accused walked free. The civil suits brought by the families of the victims fared no better. One family filed for $2 million, others sued for every dollar they believed they were owed, and none of them received a cent, because the courts found that the Knickerbocker had met the building codes that existed at the time of its construction, and the codes had not anticipated the load conditions that caused the failure. The codes were silent on what should happen when a flat-roofed building in a city that rarely saw heavy snow was buried under 28 inches of it. Because the building had been legal when it was built, no liability could be established, and the law had nothing to say to the families of the dead. Think about what that meant in practice. Families who had lost fathers and mothers and children and spouses in a building that had passed every inspection the city required, in a disaster that the investigations unanimously attributed to poor construction, were told by the legal system that no one owed them anything because the building had been legal, and therefore nothing could be done. David's family, the boy who had invited his cousin Charles to the movies that night, lost the father within a year of the disaster, and the family initially could not afford tombstones for both of them. The stones came later. Agnes Mellon had been at the theater on a date, and her body was so badly damaged by the collapse that her family was able to identify her only by the khaki shorts she was wearing. None of it appeared in any judgment. None of it changed any verdict. The law had looked at the wreckage and found, in its careful way, that no one was culpable. But the outrage that followed from the press, from the engineering community, from the families and their neighbors and the politicians who represented them, created pressure that the courts had not, and Washington, D.C. rewrote its building codes in the aftermath of the disaster. The use of arch beams as primary roof support was ended. Steel I-beams became mandatory for new construction. Minimum requirements for snow load capacity on flat roofs were established, and wall anchorage depths were codified. The specific failure modes of the Knickerbocker became, in their own unintentional way, the blueprint for a set of regulations that would govern public buildings for generations. And cities across the country looked at what had happened in Washington and quietly amended their own standards. The 98 people who died in that theater, who received no legal remedy and no financial compensation, nonetheless contributed something permanent to the safety of every public building constructed since. Harry Crandall did not retreat. 1 year after 98 people died in his theater, he hired a new architect, rebuilt inside the surviving shell of the Knickerbocker using its original facade, and opened a new venue called the Ambassador, which was larger and more ornate than its predecessor. Washington, as cities do, moved on. But Crandall was not moving on, not really. Through the 20s, as the major Hollywood studios expanded and began to dominate the industry, independent theater chains like his found themselves squeezed from every direction, and the economics of the business he had built his life around were shifting inexorably against him. By the end of the decade, he had sold what remained of his theaters, and the man who had once been worth millions ended his days with an estate that consisted of a diamond ring, a watch, a few pieces of furniture, his clothing, and some worthless stocks. In February 1937, Harry Crandall took his own life, leaving a note addressed to the newspaper reporters he knew would be writing about him. In it he wrote, "Please don't be too hard on me, boys, not for my sake, but for those I am leaving behind me. I'm despondent and miss my theater so much." He had never stopped thinking about it, not in 15 years, not through the rebuilding, not through the decline. The theater and the weight of what had happened inside it had followed him every day to the end. Reginald Gere had not survived nearly that long. His career was finished the morning the investigations began, and despite years of effort, he could not rebuild it. The indictment, even after it was dismissed, had attached itself to his name permanently, and there were no more commissions, no more landmark buildings, no more opening evenings where the city's finest came to admire what he had created. He had been the architect of the largest theater in Washington, D.C., and he had spent the last night of its existence pulling bodies from its debris with his own hands, guiding soldiers through the ruins of walls he had drawn, knowing what the building looked like from the inside, because he had designed every inch of it. In 1927, Gere turned on the gas in an attic room of his home in the Cleveland Park neighborhood, not far from where the Knickerbocker had stood, now wearing the face he had given it a decade before as the Ambassador. He was 55 years old. The two men who had created that building, one who had dreamed of it and one who had drawn it, both ended the same way, haunted by the same Saturday night, across a span of 15 years. The Ambassador Theater operated for decades after the Knickerbocker's collapse. By the late 1960s, it had changed entirely in character, becoming a venue for rock concerts and counterculture events, hosting Jimi Hendrix's first Washington concert in 1967 and a reading by Norman Mailer months later. In 1969, it was demolished as part of an urban renewal program, and a bank was built on the site, its architects giving it a shape deliberately reminiscent of a theater. The only formal acknowledgement that something meaningful had once stood on that corner. There is no plaque on the corner of 18th Street and Columbia Road. There is no official memorial. Visitors to Adams Morgan today, walking past that intersection, have no way of knowing what happened there on a Saturday night over a century ago. The storm has kept its name. It is still called the Knickerbocker Storm, still the largest snowfall in Washington's recorded history. But the theater and the disaster and the 98 people have slipped from common memory in a way that is difficult to explain for an event that was, in its day, the banner headline of every major newspaper in the country. Perhaps that is because disasters are easiest to remember when they have a clear villain, a negligent operator who ignored warnings, a company that knew what was coming and said nothing, a decision-maker who saw the danger and chose profit over lives. Those are stories that fit a shape we recognize and we hold on to them. But the Knickerbocker does not offer that. There is no single moment of deliberate wrongdoing at its center. What it offers instead is something more unsettling, and in many ways more difficult to sit with, a building that was legal, that passed every inspection the city required, that was celebrated in the press and loved by the people who used it, and that had carried inside its walls a flaw so small, so far below the surface of anything a casual inspection could detect, that 5 years of full operation gave no sign of it whatsoever. The flaw was not dramatic. It was a measurement, 2 inches of steel bearing in a wall instead of 8, a margin that showed itself in no visible crack, no audible groan, no warning that could have sent 300 people out into the snow before the ceiling came down. What broke it, in the end, was simply the weather. 2 days of snow that would not stop, accumulating on a flat roof above beams that were never truly held, above a city that was watching from its windows and waiting for the storm to pass. 300 people settled into their seats that evening in a theater they had every reason to trust because the city had told them it was safe, and 5 years of Saturday nights had given them no reason to think otherwise. Outside, the worst snowstorm in the city's history was finally beginning to ease. It must have felt, for a few minutes in those warm gold and ivory seats, like the night had turned a corner and the worst of it was behind them. What nobody in that building could know, what no inspection had ever revealed and no code had ever caught, was that the worst was already above them, had been above them for 5 years, through every screening and every concert and every lecture that had ever taken place inside those walls, and was, at that precise moment, finding the last edge of what the walls could hold. The steel was bending. The shallow anchors were working free. The snow was not moving, and when the ceiling finally gave way, it did so without a second's warning, and the people below had no moment to understand what was happening, no moment to rise from their seats or reach for the person beside them. It was, in the words of one witness who survived it, as sudden as the light going out. 98 people, one building, one flaw that measured 6 inches short of what the drawings required. And a city that has never, in over 100 years, seen a single worse day than that Saturday night in January when the snow finally stopped falling and the ceiling came down instead.